Hello. I want to welcome everyone here today. We have a lot of our friends from the GLCA and the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. I know we might have some folks on here from EFIT and Flame and Foreman Christian. So we're glad that you all could join us today for this special presentation of the GLCA GLAA Consortium for Teaching and Learning, which is a mouthful. So we also call ourselves the CTL. And we are joined by a very special guest, Rick Detweiler, to talk about his book, The Evidence Liberal Arts Needs, Lives of Consequence, Inquiry, and Accomplishment. My name is Colleen Monahan-Smith at the GLCA, and I'm joined with my colleagues Charlotte White and Steve Volk, who the three of us serve as co-directors of the CTL. Wanted to do just some very quick housekeeping. We are going to have about 30 minutes of conversation between Steve and Rick, and then we'll open it up, excuse me, to audience questions. So feel free to put questions in the Q&A, not the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. We'll see how our timing goes. I also wanted to let you know about where you can purchase Rick's book. You can get it anywhere that books are sold, but also we were able to work out a special discount if you buy directly through Penguin Random House on their website and use the code evidence20, then you can have a 20% discount and free shipping. Unfortunately, it's not free shipping internationally, but anyway, hope that you might take advantage of that. And I wanted to go ahead and introduce Rick Detweiler. He's the President Emeritus of the GLCA and the founder of the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. He's also the founder and managing director of Higher Ed Impact, a nonprofit higher education consulting initiative. Prior to the GLCA, Rick was president and professor of psychology at Hartwick College in New York. He was vice president and professor of psychology at Drew University in New Jersey. He's a trained social psychologist and holds a doctorate from Princeton. And he will be joined in conversation with Steve Volk, who is an emeritus professor of history at Oberlin and the founder of their Teaching and Learning Center. He also has a blog after class on education and democracy and co-director of the CTL. So without further ado, we can begin the conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with Rick. I met Rick a number of years ago when he was the head of the GLCA, and so enjoyed my conversations with him and learning from him over these years that it's just a pleasure to be in conversation with you again, Rick, and for a lot of our folks out there, both from the GLCA, and thank you for those joining from abroad, where it is probably very late at night in many of the places that you're tuning in for. So, Rick, let me just sort of set the context here. There's sort of 2 points that I think are important as we begin to dig into some of the questions that you raise in your book. The first one is, as you and I think everybody knows, we are in an incredibly deep partisan divide about the value of higher education itself, the value of even going to college. And you find polling that will come up with these stark numbers that 80% of Republicans don't think a college education is worth it in any sense. And close to 80% of Democrats who do think. So we've got this real divide on a partisan level about what it means, right? The second thing is that there has been a long discussion within the higher ed world about the purpose of a college and a university education in general. And there has been a sort of increasing drumbeat of of focusing on ROI, return on investment, right? That higher education should be about preparing students for their first job. Okay, you begin in a very different fashion. You argue that, and I'll quote from your book, one of the most important vexing issues now facing higher education in the US is the role of the liberal arts. And it's an observation that leads to one of your really primary questions, which is, do graduates who have studied in a liberal arts context live a more successful or a better life? And those of us in the field have been trying to get at that for a long time. So I hope we could sort of engage that in conversation. And I want to begin with the very first sort of definitional, back to Webster's whatever point, which is, what do you mean by a liberal arts context? Because I know it's not just studying at a liberal arts college.
That's really the central question, I think, in my mind. I didn't start out I tried to start out with a definition of the liberal arts, but as I began to look at those definitions seriously, including those that I had espoused over the years as a faculty member and as a college president, and as the president of the GLCA, I found that there was a lack of clarity, to say the least, and a lot of different kinds of ways of approaching the question of what the liberal arts is. And certainly the public understanding of the liberal arts is a messy one at best. But even more disturbing, the definition of the liberal arts is messy on individual campuses. People think it is something, or espouse something, or advocate something without much consistency across institutions, or even agreement within institutions. Other than the liberal arts involves some content of study, it's the subjects you study, is the typical kind of default. That's what people think the liberal arts is about. So to go back to your question, what is the liberal arts context? I didn't set out at the beginning to say the liberal arts is made up of this and this and this. I decided I needed to go back and look at the practice of the liberal arts as it has been implemented over literally millennia in ancient Greece, Rome. In fact, for a long period of time during the Islamic Golden Age in the Islamic world, a largely untold story about the development of the liberal arts, and then back into Europe, and ultimately to the United States, and now, of course, abroad again. And I decided I just needed to look at what over those millennia was happening as the liberal arts education was delivered. And what I learned, not by reading the philosophers, but by reading about the practices, is that yes, there is a content to what liberal arts study is about, but very importantly, there is an educational context. And that context is one that engages people meaningfully with one another. So meaningful engagement. It's students with faculty, students with students, et cetera, staff with everybody, so that there has always been, and I could tell you more stories about that if you're interested, or if there is time, or you can find it in the book, in fact, what has been consistent about liberal arts education, or education that has been delivered in the liberal arts tradition, let me say it that way, is that people are meaningfully involved with one another in the educational environment, and that happens in addition to the content of study. And so what does that meaningful involvement mean? It means faculty relationship with students outside of class time, because class, of course, is the idea of going to class is over those millennia, a relatively recent invention. And so the idea that you learn in class and you do other things outside of class that might be fun or that make it nicer to be there, that distinction did not exist until, again, in the millennial perspective, relatively recent years. So what does it mean what is the educational context of the liberal arts? It's meaningful involvement of faculty with students and students with students about ideas, things that are being learned, but also about life and ways in which people develop. So engaging with other students who bring different kinds of perspectives and involvement with them outside of class time. It does include what we would today call high impact pedagogy. So it does involve methods of pedagogy, of teaching and learning that involve students in the learning and thinking process. And very importantly, it involves the whole educational environment, the experience a student is having, not because they go to classes, but because they are a part of an educational community. So that notion of, and I talk about authentic community, is really a critical feature of what the practice of liberal arts has been over the millennia. And it turns out to be incredibly important today as well.
Yeah, there are so many issues there that I would like to go in and unpack, but I want to take one step back, because you, in defining your work, and defining the sort of higher education in general, you look at three key issues. One is purpose, one is content, and one is context. And
Yes.
we've been talking a lot about content and context, and I want to get back to that. Let me go back to purpose for a moment, because again, there's a lot of controversy within the higher education media, within the field in general, about what the purpose is. Is higher education there to serve a public good? Is often how the argument is placed, or should we see it as a private benefit? In other words, I do this in order to get my credential, in order to go on and make more money, et cetera, et cetera. And you clearly come down on one side, but why? Why not just argue that if you could do better with a college degree, then why not get one? So how do you talk about a bit of the purpose of the higher education?
Well, and again, I owe this to insights developed as I read the history, but because the purpose of a liberal arts education, or the purpose of a higher education, has changed and evolved over time. It's not been a singular thing. In the United States at this time, diversity, equity, inclusion is a high priority topic. A decade or two ago, it was democracy. Before that, anyway, there is an evolving stated purpose, which is either acceptable or not acceptable to society, of interest to students and parents, or not of interest to students and parents. So the purpose in that sense has not been consistent or constant over time. But what has been constant is a liberal arts education has always been focused on the common good. And it erases that view sees as a false dichotomy between a private good, that is, how can I benefit myself, become more successful or richer, or whatever that kinds of things are, and those activities that are benefit to society, and help the society to grow in ways that are productive and helpful for that society. And so this common good idea says, well, it's not about private selfish gain, nor is it just about serving the state. It's about creating a healthier, more successful world in which the person can be more successful, more fulfilled, and from which society equally benefits. So I focus on this idea of creating a common good, not a selfish good, or simply a public good. And again, when you look at the history of higher education, there was a big line drawn back in the early 1800s in what was then Prussia at that time, in which higher education became the European model, which spread all around the world. The idea was to serve the state. So you wanted to strengthen the state by your education. In the young United States at that time, that model was rejected, not because the idea of serving society was rejected, but because the belief was we can mutually benefit through the values and learning that occurs in a liberal arts education. The person advances, society advances equally. And the specific definition, what is the highest priority at a particular moment, will vary with time. The specifics will vary, but that broader common purpose is what is maintained and has been maintained literally for millennia.
Yeah. Well, let me pursue that a little bit, and let me remind folks who are listening in to us that if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A function of the Zoom. That's the one function you could have access to. So start populating with your questions. So clearly, as you've been arguing, that how we define the common good will change over time. And there's, again, right now, there's lots of different questions about what exactly does it mean to define that public or common good. I was interested in an article that the sociologist Jonathan Haidt wrote maybe a week or so, maybe 2 weeks ago, in which he suggested that while universities and colleges may have a different set of a wide set of goals, and he names, for example, a winning sports team or social justice initiatives, that there's only one telos of the university, which is the search for truth. And I'm wondering how you think about this in the context of the search for truth or the search for a common good, and how do you sort of bring those two together?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that a liberal arts education is designed to be the first advanced degree, and in my judgment, I would argue that the common good is the purpose to be served by that undergraduate education. That involves search for truth or questions of truth. An effective liberal arts educational experience, faculty do challenge student thinking, do encourage them to develop their own thinking and ideas in ways that are supported by fact and critical analysis and all of those kinds of things. But that the outcome of a liberal arts education is not the search for truth per se. That's what develops as one specializes in a field and pursues that more closely, whether that is in philosophy and religion, or it is in physics or sociology, and that is a different level of purpose. That's a intellectual purpose, which is absolutely important, but is not the purpose of a liberal arts education. It's a piece of what happens in that liberal arts education, but it's not its purpose. So I would pull those apart, and I think that we do ourselves a disservice in higher education in our talking about why we exist and why students should engage in it or public policy should support it. I think we do ourselves a disservice when what we say is the purpose of what we are trying to provide to large numbers of people is per se the search for truth. I would say it is per se the advancement of society and the individual, and that is a more important first goal than that more intellectual pursuit that is a part of it, of a advanced degree.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I want to bring in a question that just popped up from one of our GLAA colleagues, and she talks about this issue of a better life coming out of this as something more than the common good, that this relationship between a social good and a better life for an individual. And I wonder if you could talk about that concept of the better life, because obviously it's a slippery concept. Maybe a better life is making oodles of money or
Yes.
etc. So how do you think about that?
I don't separate them into different. They are in different categories, but I don't separate them as antithetical to one another. That the common good, as I have defined it, includes the success of the individual, or it can include the success of the individual. It also includes living a fulfilled life. So living a life that a person says, this is meaningful to me, and I'm doing things that express my my sense of purpose and making a difference in the ways that matter to me. So I see them as separate goals people may have, but that they are both a part of this common good idea. So what benefits the that the goals one has in benefiting the individual are also goals that from which society can benefit. That it's not a selfish pursuit, but that it is toward outcomes that are of benefit to the individual and to society. I don't know. Do you think that hit the question, Steve, or have I talked around it?
I think that's right. I mean, hard to comment on the question, but in the sense that if you imagine a world in which people are essentially living unmeaningful lives, which I'm afraid a lot of people are sort of involved in, then it's not going to produce a world that is conducive to the kinds of values that I think we would all uphold. And so in that sense, the better life, the kind of meaningful life that you're talking about is I would see as sort of essential foundation stone for a common good, where people see their interests as both, I can't engage in this world if I'm feeling alienated from it, and my lack of alienation can help create a better world. So there's that context. And I'll just add one other comment that came up from the same person. Who defines this? How do we get to a notion of the better a better life, or a common good?
Right, and that's a really interesting question, and I see it as very much defined within one's own life and environment, so that there is not a singular definition. In some environments, so if you're in the United States, there may be some particular aspects of serving the common good that are obvious. Donate money and vote. In some countries, the notion of donating money is not a part of the cultural, legal, or political tradition, so that's not a measure of it. What does it mean to be fulfilled? Well, I think in all cases, it's the question to the individual: are you feeling that you are living a life that you find meaningful? Some version of that. What is a meaningful life for, in some places, will be different than for others. So I think ultimately those definitions come down to the environment and that in which a person is living and learning and having their own life, but that the definition is not culturally imposed. It is organic to the life of an individual in a particular environment.
Good. Well, let's move off of purpose into these other areas, particularly what you define as the how this education is experienced, the educational context, what you call and I like this term, the educational ecology. And it's in defining that educational ecology that I think you come closest to defining what goes on, or at least what should go on, at residential liberal arts colleges. And I want you to talk a little bit more about this context question, because you will argue that the educational context, what you called about the sort of meaningful connections between shareholders, really, of this educational enterprise, that it is more important than the content that you will actually pick up at the time. So I wonder if you could explore that a bit more.
It's interesting. I reflect back to when I was a young professor in my first higher ed job, and I came there educated as a specialist, passionate about my discipline, passionate about the research that was central to the work to the life that had brought me into my advanced degree program, etc. And I didn't at that point in time think too much about what students were doing as I interacted with them, other than that pursuit of knowledge, the truth, I suppose. In that sense, I was I was one of those people. I was the scholarly individual. And I saw that I believe that what happened otherwise to the student was not of my interest or responsibility. Other people were responsible for that. Now, over time, my perspectives changed as I began to understand the degree to which life outside of the classroom and outside of the course of study was important to students' lives. But I have to say, I never sufficiently appreciated, at least insofar as the way the research turned out, the phenomenal power of the educational context. So in this research, looking at the kinds of experiences a student has in college, what they studied, the nature of the classroom, etc., in which I ask questions about all of those aspects, the content of the study. Also asked a lot of questions about the educational context, all derived out of this historical framework that I brought. And I have to say, one of a number of surprises for me out of all of that was to find that the educational context was far more predictive of a range of life outcomes: leadership, meaningful engagement in society, continued learning, living a fulfilled life, living a successful life, that the most consistent predictors of those kinds of life outcomes, that is, people not just when they graduate, but as they become adults and live lives of the next 40 years, that the educational context was far more consistently predictive of positive life outcomes of all kinds than was the content of study. And so, that led me back to say, how could this be? Aren't we about going to college and learning some specific thing? Well, yeah, that's a part of it. But it turns out, and again, especially these days when you can learn all kinds of things on your cell phone without needing to go to anybody. Well, facts can come from lots of places, but the real process of learning and thinking and developing as the individual that will be able to live productively in life come out of these relationships one develops and experiences during college, and that is where far more frequently the power comes. The one predictor of all kinds of life outcomes, positive life outcomes, the most consistent was involvement in what I called an authentic community. So what is that? That is spending time with faculty outside of class time, talking not just about academic matters, but non-academic matters. Gee, what's going on? Where are you going? What's of interest to you, etc. It has to do with meaningful involvement of students outside of class time. So you're talking about issues of significance with others, developing these ways of living, learning, and being involved with other people. It involves being involved in activities outside of class time. And so it begins to, for me, say we've created barriers in our thinking about what a liberal arts education is about. We have academic affairs and we have student life, different kinds of labels, but we see those as kind of two separate functions, and that academic affairs is the senior partner and the other is kind of the hospitality services that keep students happy and involved. Well, that's not the case. Faculty need to be, if they really care about developing individuals who will not only will pursue knowledge and will be successful and will contribute to society and will live fulfilled lives, they are also equally responsible for engaging with students outside of class time in ways that help that happen, and that those involved in student life are not them over there, but that we are all partners together in the growth and development of individual students who will now live lives of meaning and success.
Yeah, I love that. I sort of want to follow up some more on that. But let me ask a question prior to that, which is, you do a lot of study about sort of the impact of various aspects, the value of various engagements that students may have on a campus. ultimately arguing that, don't spend so much time thinking about what major you want to be,
Right.
but think, so put yourself back on campus as a faculty member, and a first-year student walks into your office, says, "Hi, Professor Detweiler, I'm about to start my 4 years here. What advice do you have for me?" So how would you respond?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is be involved. And that means reach out to your professors, talk with them outside of class time. And if not every faculty member is kind of encouraging of that, find some that are. Talk to them not just about the course of study, but about broader things in your life or in society, or issues that are important to your thinking. It means find ways to be involved in the college's life and activities. Maybe it's clubs, maybe it's sports, maybe it's student leadership. Maybe it could be volunteerism. It could be all kinds of things, but find ways to be involved with other students on campus. So it's engagement with other people in which ideas flow back and forth. You have the opportunity to work with, to think with, to live with, in meaningful ways, other individuals. So that from the outcome of this research, I would put up there very much as a #1 priority. Very different than the advice I would have given back all of those years ago when I first began as a faculty member, when my encouragement would have been, become involved in this research project, read these materials. Not that those are bad things, but that's insufficient. It's this broader engagement with the people who are part of your educational environment that really makes the difference.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, I use in the book, and others have as well, it's an ecology. So just as we can't predict the future of humanity or of the earth or of a particular wild animal by just focusing on that one small piece, we have to look at the ways in which things interact. A liberal arts education, unlike other approaches to education, truly is a educational ecology involving what one studies and that environment with other people that surrounds that course of study.
Yeah. Let me remind folks out there that if you have questions for Rick, please put them into the Q&A function, and we'll pass them along as we go on. I so resonate with a lot of what you're saying. I do think about my earlier years when I was teaching at the start, when usually, first year student comes in and you say, "So what do you want to major in?" And it wasn't long before I dropped that altogether.
Yeah.
And part of the experiences of teaching at a liberal arts college, I remember the kind of impact that it had on me, that one day I went to see a student production play on campus, Into the Woods it was. And there was one of my students who was in a lead role of this play. And it suddenly I realized that for that student,
Yes,
that experience was so much more important than anything I had to teach him about Latin American history, which is a little deflating, but then you realize, but wait, this is all, this all works together. So how do we make that kind of interaction work? And so let me pose that question to you now, because once again, liberal arts colleges, residential liberal arts colleges, have so many advantages in this. I mean, I appreciate what you say about learning in the liberal arts context. It doesn't have to be at one of our colleges, but nonetheless, we have all the advantages.
we do.
And we tend not to use them. Right?
We do. It's absolutely
You talk about this separation between residential life and academic life. And so how do you think about what can we do to bring those different silos in conversation with each other in a way that we can do? But if you're talking about, Michigan State, it's much harder. So what can we do?
Yes. Well, if there are really two aspects to that question. One is what we say and do to the outside world. The other is what we say and do to our inside world within our institutions. And I'm interpreting your question really to be the inside one. So the first thing that I think we need to do is look at the expectations and rewards for faculty. That is to say, what are the factors that create promotion, tenure, maybe a higher salary, and a respect of one's colleagues. What are the things that count there? Well, if it's a liberal arts college, teaching evaluations are going to be on that list, but it's probably also going to be scholarly activity and some portion of service on faculty committees, and those are the things that are counted. And for colleague esteem, it's going to be scholarship. For the dean who administers promotion and so forth, excuse me, it's going to be also service and course evaluations. Excuse me. And a faculty member probably is going to have to spend some amount of time with office hours. But to what degree are faculty encouraged, rewarded, or given esteem because they go to that student play, or they go to the basketball game, or they spend time outside, in just open conversation with students about interesting issues in that student's lives or of the day? Those things are neither given esteem nor recognition. And in fact, they oftentimes are associated with faculty who other faculty will, or academic administrators will think of as kind of checked out. They're no longer quite so serious about their discipline. They're involved in these other kinds of ways. So we need to change the evaluation and reward system and ways in which faculty are viewed as performing important activities when they do those outside of class, outside of scholarly activities, involvement with students. At the same time, we need to not be separating our institutions into academic affairs and residential life with entirely separate reporting structures. Faculty, other than complaining, shouldn't be saying anything about what happens in residential life. People in residential life, keep your hands away from anything having to do with academic affairs. Maybe you can help out with something or another, but keep your distance. We now need to create dialogue across those sides in which not based upon one's professional perspectives. Being a student life professional is a profession, just as being a psychologist or a professor of whatever type is a profession. But to bring those together and say, our purpose here is not the advancement of our professions. Our purpose here is the advancement of our students. And let's look at ways in which we can, in fact, join to make important things happen for our student lives so that they become productive and successful individuals in their life ahead. So it's really a fundamental change from the balkanization that's been traditional to the integration and reward system, which needs to be different than it is at virtually any institution at this time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there is, at our own residential liberal arts colleges, which put a lot of emphasis on teaching.
Yeah,
we are teaching heavy. At the same time, the reward structures replicate those of R1 universities to a large degree, with a slightly less quantitative, aspect to it. And so we really have to sort of think about that. And the only thing I would add to what you're saying is that everything that you're saying implies a greater level of interaction between faculty and staff.
yes,
Because often faculty will look down on staff. Oh, you don't have the diet. And I think about the value that could be had for a faculty member preparing a course on whatever, thinking about, well, how do I get the most out of this class? And so you want to consult students and see what they're saying. You might want to consult Res Life and see how that impacts them, or a coach, or et cetera.
Yes.
And you construct a syllabus and construct an education that takes advantage of all these strengths that we have. So yeah, let me go a different way. And once again, let me remind folks that that the Q&A is there for questions that you may have. So your book is probably the only one I have read within this area that is based on a very sophisticated statistical analysis. And what you do, as you argue, you can't argue these causalities, definitively, but they are very suggestive. And they're suggestive of all the kinds of things we have been saying in terms of the importance of relationships, in terms of the importance of this educational ecology or the environment around it. And the end result, as you find in your study, is that that those who have gone through this can lead, statistically speaking, sort of looking at this, lives of consequence, inquiry, and accomplishment. So one of the things that we were just talking about is how do we sort of ensure this internally. The other side of this, that you and many others, I'm thinking of Andrew Delbanco and quite a few other writers, say, how do we make this argument? How do we make our case understood, particularly when we're under fire, not just the fact that liberal is in our name, in the sense of what we do, but we seem to have a real difficulty in discussing the value of this kind of liberal education, when it's so much easier to say, well, look, if you major in business, you'll get a lot of money and you'll be better off and everything will be fine. So how do you make the public argument that is made so strongly within your book?
Yeah, and in some ways, that's the most vexing question for us in liberal arts education, because it's within the control of our faculty, of our academic administrators, of our presidents, to begin looking internally to say, what can we do to begin having a larger impact on our graduates' lives? And that's not that that's going to happen everywhere, but if it doesn't, well, shame on you for not making that happen. What do we say to the outside world? Well, we're in this environment where jobs are king, and first jobs tend to be king, where earning income is in the United States currently the principal measure of college success, college impact. And if you go to a government site and look up institutions, well, they'll come back to you ordered by graduate salaries and things like that. So we are in that kind of environment. Now, it's not bad to earn a good income or have a good job. And part of what I learned is it's not at all antithetical. In fact, it is an outcome of particular aspects of a liberal arts educational experience, but that there are other outcomes as well. And so, number one, I think we need to begin as liberal arts institutions making a coherent single argument about why we make a difference. Right now, every institution is using its own terminology, its own advocacy, partly because it's a competitive environment and we want to make sure students come to our liberal arts institution and not somebody else's. But if we all began using the same kinds of ways of talking about the liberal arts, which is based on life outcomes, not on empty rhetoric or every institution making the case differently, if the public would begin to hear consistent ideas about the common good, you wouldn't use those words probably as you're talking publicly, but you can say students who graduate from our college, like other liberal arts colleges, are more likely to be over the long term successful, to be involved in meaningful ways in our community, in our society, to live more meaningful and fulfilled lives, etc. If every institution began to use those kinds of descriptions, I think that's step number one. Step number two, it would be very simple for individual institutions to assess their current students' experience. How often, do faculty know you by your first name? How often do you have various kinds of engaged experiences? And I have, 35 questions that are a basis of the work that I did that could be used. Every institution doesn't need to measure the life outcomes of students 30 or 40 years from now. They could compare the level of engagement in their campus, etc. The span of study, another one that is the content of study, another important predictor, could measure those kinds of things and in effect now say, well, relative to, for the United States, there's now a database of information that I've collected from all kinds of institutions relative to American higher education. Our students engage more meaningfully more frequently with faculty than at most institutions. And that's associated with these kinds of life outcomes. So individual institutions could begin to document ways in which they, in fact, are implementing practices that have meaningful life outcome. And if in doing that assessment and reporting those results, some are not working so well, that gives an opportunity to prioritize. NSSE, the National Study of Student Engagement, this has been going on for a couple of decades now. Institutions can look at student engagement by the standards created in NSSE, which do have to do with student involvement, and certainly. But in that same kind of way, using these questions that are associated with specific life outcomes, institutions could begin to document ways in which they actually are different. Go to the University of Michigan and get a really fine education, there's no doubt. And you can major in any one of 150 different areas or whatever it is, there's no doubt about that. If a student really works hard at it, they can probably find faculty that will be willing to spend time with them, and they will be able to find ways in which they can involve themselves with other students because there's a zillion clubs and activities. But again, in my research, where does that happen? In fact, twice as often. Where does it happen because you're in that educational environment? It happens at liberal arts-based institutions. So as you said earlier, a student can have that experience almost anywhere, but at most institutions, they have to work hard to try to make it happen. And that's a difficult expectation to place on an individual 18, 19, 20-year-old. Whereas at liberal arts focused institutions, those things, you have to work not to have those experiences. I have 3 children. One went to a research university, and my advice to her was, when you go there, make sure you reach out to a faculty member. This was before I did the research, but the part of that I lamented about her choice is I knew what kind of experience she would have with faculty as well as with other students at a liberal arts-based institution, which she also applied to, but she was won over by a research university. And she did do that. And she found a faculty member that was so delighted to have a student actually talk to him that he did engage with her and changed her life. So she had much of that liberal arts experience at a research university because she knew enough to work at making that happen. My other 2 went to liberal arts institutions. Those kinds of things happened as a part of the experience. And had they not wanted them to happen, they would have had to be conscientious about figuring out how not to engage. So we need to make clear that a liberal arts experience is not an education specifically for a job in a very nice environment with great hospitality services, which is the way liberal arts colleges tend to come across. And oh, by the way, you're also going to study some history and philosophy and so forth, because that's a part of our curriculum. That the notion that this is really a distinctive kind of educational experience that has important life outcomes. That's what we now need to be saying to the in our public communications, in our admissions materials, in our recruitment efforts, and to be asking students, what is it you want out of your educational experience? Do you want a job? Yep, probably that's on the list. What else matters to you? You know, do you want to be meaningfully involved in society? Do you want to become a leader? Do you want to live with a sense of fulfillment? And students today are widely different, but at least in the U.S., young people today are looking for more than money in their pocket. They're looking for ways to live meaningful and useful lives, and that needs to be a part of the way we really frame to the world what our educational experience is about.
Yeah, and that's great. There's been a number of books published that suggest the importance of relationship. I think of
Yes.
Chambliss and Takas, and I think of Peter Felton's work and things of that nature. Yours does bring this sort of statistical analysis of not just what can succeed on campus, but how that carries out to the later life. And I see we have one question that came in terms of one aspect of that, which is leadership. The questioner would like you to share your thoughts on the study of leadership in a liberal arts educational context, because I know at one point in the book you argue that you found that that playing a leadership role in a campus organization, even more than athletics, seems to have a continuing life impact. So could you talk, about that some more?
Yes, I think it's one of those aspects of life outcome that is associated not with the intellectual study of a subject, like you study leadership in college and then you become a leader, but is closely, highly associated with the nature of the experiences you have. So if in a college environment, one engages with other students, active in clubs, activities, whatever those kinds of things are, then one behaviorally has the experience of learning how to work with and in fact influence, lead, shape, inspire other people. And that it happens in an environment, in a constructive environment. This isn't going off into a hostile world in which you're trying to fundamentally change the way something is going on in one society. It's happening in an environment in which people have shared values and shared perspective, shared broader goals, and that it's that kind of it's almost like an internship, having those kinds of experiences in an environment where then you can get feedback and guidance and counseling from people in that student life or from faculty and from other students that help you learn the kinds of behaviors that really lead to life leadership, and that's where the payoff really does occur.
Mm-hmm. We have another question that circles back to some of these issues we've been talking about. It sort of thinks once again about what we as at traditional liberal arts, residential liberal arts colleges sort of pride ourselves on. And the questioner notes that, there's an awful lot of pressure these days put on colleges like our own to stress the STEM fields, to stress data sciences, to stress global business or health initiatives, things of that, which at some level can integrate with a common liberal arts notion, but is often pushing liberal arts colleges towards the more pre-professional kinds of vocational kinds of education. And the questioner asks, how do we reconcile this with a more traditional view of a humanities, perhaps centered liberal arts approach?
It is a challenging time in that regard, and because you're absolutely right that pressure is enormous, and it's difficult these days to find institutions that are not adding or have in relatively recent years added various kinds of pre-professional degree programs. Insofar as positive life outcome, and now I'm talking about both success, earning more money, being in a higher position, as well as living a fulfilled life, for example, at the other end of that continuum, as well as other kinds of life outcomes. What matters based on this research really are two things. One is span of study. And that is to say, those students who half or more of their coursework was outside of their area of major were more successful and fulfilled as adults, i.e. more success means you're 55 years old and you're earning more money and you're in a higher position in an organization. So broader span of study is highly associated with long-term life success. Maybe not that first job, but over the long term it is. And so part one of my response to that is what we need to do for both professional, pre-professional programs, but also for all other majors. There is a requirements creep at most institutions in which, well, you've got to take so many courses in this area of study, there's not much time left for anything else. That's what's fundamentally destructive of a liberal arts education. And span of study now is inclusive of the humanities, absolutely, but it doesn't mean just adding humanities is sufficient. You need students to study broadly so that their thinking is expanded. They look at any issue can look at any issue from a variety of perspectives, but that span of study is what needs to be protected. So don't fight off the professional, pre-professional program if that's part of what your institution needs to do to stay into business. Fight off the growth of requirements within a major which preclude a student studying broadly. You want every student to study broadly. And then the second thing I'd say is, again, based on the research, that the questions that humanists ask, that is, if you are concerned about the role of the humanities, that in the research at least, studying humanities per se was not the predictive question. The predictive question was whether humanities-like questions were asked in all kinds of disciplines. So what are the implications for humanity, for the future of our society, for individual fulfillment and success of this area, whether it's biology or chemistry? Those questions can be asked equally as well as in sociology, psychology, English, or philosophy, and that it is really what I would think of as humanities across the curriculum, which is an area in which we ought to be focusing more. And so, and now that's uncomfortable. Again, I think of myself as a young professor of psychology, assistant professor of psychology. I was uneasy with those kinds of questions, but at a liberal arts college, I need to be mentored. Maybe that should be part of our course development, professional teaching development programs to help faculty in disciplines who have become specialists to think about how they can engage students as well as themselves in asking these bigger questions of significance to both the individual's life and to the future of humanity. And that it's bringing those humanistic perspectives in across the curriculum that really is a second key to an impactful liberal arts educational experience.
Fantastic. I'm mindful of the time, and we're just about out of it. I want to get to one final question briefly before we close out, which ties into what you're saying, I think, which is the relationship between this undergraduate focus as you're defining, and how students will then move on to different things within to pursue advanced degrees in graduate or professional school. And how do you see the one tying into the other? And I think that will be the last question we'll be able to take. But how do you see that?
Again, I see it as natural. That is to say, the undergraduate experience can and should include practical involvement and engagement, internships, and all of those kinds of things should be a part of that educational ecology. The development of one's intellectual skills is a part of that experience. And so what can happen very naturally in my mind is as one becomes more engaged in a particular area of focus, then graduate school is a very logical and in some sense, easy transition. You know, in the US, medical school admission rates are highest for humanities majors who also take the sciences. They're higher for that cohort than they are for those who study only in the sciences. So it's not that the world graduate programs don't seek people with that kind of background, but what they need is those individuals who are committed to an area of learning. And in fact, liberal arts study prepares one more effectively for that kind of specialization than a specialized major in which you're going from specialization to increased specialization. Longer term life success is not related to specialization. It's related to the ability to learn new things as the world changes, as knowledge changes, as understandings change. And a liberal arts education prepares one better in that regard than any other approach to education. And I might add as a quick footnote that these kinds of effects are 2 or 3 times larger for students who come from a lower socioeconomic background. So those students who came from families that were not college educated, likely, that did not have a lot of wealth, those are far more impacted by these experiences than are those who come from a more privileged background. So liberal arts matters. It makes a difference in life for the individual and for our society.
Well, Rick, I feel we could talk for the rest of the afternoon, and I still would want some more. But let me thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Colleen in a second. I just want to thank you for the book. I have argued about liberal arts for a long time based on anecdotal information, and now we have a strong statistical case to prove as well. So thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation, and over to you, Colleen.
Yeah, I just want to echo my thanks, Steve. Thanks for your engaging questions. And Rick, thanks for being a leader and making a difference for those of us who care about the impact of a liberal arts education. Just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this, so the recording will be available. And then also just, again, if you want to purchase the book, your local independent bookstore and any other place where you buy books, but also through the Penguin Random House website, we have a discount code Evidence20 that you can use for free domestic shipping and a discount on the book. So thanks everyone for joining today, and we'll see you at our next CTL discussion.
My thanks as well. Thanks.